The cold wind whistled through the trees, scattering dry leaves across the dense forest floor. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold as Bram Calloway, an aging lumberjack with a thick beard and graying hair, finished another long day of work. He was a solitary man, his hands rough from years of labor, his gaze tired from a lifetime of solitude. For years, he had lived in a remote cabin, far from the noise of the city. His saw rested beside the massive fallen trunk. Bram wiped the sweat from his brow and prepared to head home. But just as he took a step back, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the forest. Before he could react, a huge tree came crashing down. The impact was brutal. Bram hit the ground hard, a searing pain shooting through his leg. The crushing weight of the tree pinned his left leg beneath it. He tried to move, but the pain was unbearable. The old lumberjack looked around. The forest was eerily silent, except for the distant call of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. There was no one around. His breathing quickened. He shouted for help, but his voice faded into the vastness of the woods. Panic started creeping in. Night was approaching, and the temperature was already beginning to drop. If no one found him soon, he might not survive. Then, a distant sound echoed through the trees, the rhythmic beat of hooves against the damp earth. Bram lifted his head, holding his breath. Out of the shadows of the forest, a horse emerged. A black Mangalarga Marchador. The animal was magnificent, its sleek coat gleaming under the fading sunlight. Its dark eyes studied Bram with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The horse stopped just a few feet away, watching him with a mix of curiosity and something else, something Bram couldn't quite place. Still on the ground, Bram reached out a trembling hand. "Hey there, boy!" His voice was weak, barely a whisper. The horse let out a soft breath but did not retreat. It was not domesticated. No saddle, no bridle. A spirit of the wild. And yet, in that moment, Bram sensed something in the horse's gaze. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as if the animal understood that he was in trouble. Then, something incredible happened. The black Mangalarga Marchador stood motionless, its ears flicking forward, studying the trapped man with quiet intensity. The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the forest floor, and the air grew colder by the minute. Bram Calloway's breathing was ragged, his body trembling from pain and exhaustion. His leg throbbed beneath the crushing weight of the fallen tree. He had tried to move it, tried to push with all his remaining strength, but it was no use. The tree was too heavy. He was trapped. Alone. Or at least, he thought he was alone. The horse didn't leave. It stood there, watching. Waiting. Bram swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't understand why, but something about the horse's presence comforted him. Maybe it was the stillness in its posture, the way its dark eyes held his gaze, unwavering. It wasn't just an ordinary wild horse. You're not afraid of me, huh?" Bram whispered, his voice hoarse. The horse exhaled, a soft, warm breath visible in the evening chill. Its nostrils flared, sensing something deeper than mere survival instinct. Bram felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but he couldn't afford to close his eyes. If he passed out, he wasn't sure he'd wake up again. His fingers dug into the damp earth as he tried to think, tried to figure out a way to get free. But how? The black horse took a step closer. Bram tensed, unsure of what it would do. The horse's muscles rippled beneath its sleek coat as it lowered its head slightly, nostrils flaring once more. Then, it did something unexpected. It nudged his shoulder. Bram's eyes widened. It wasn't a forceful push, just enough to jolt him out of his daze. Was it trying to keep him awake? His heart pounded in his chest. He had seen horses in the wild before, but none had ever come this close. None had ever acknowledged him like this. "You trying to help me, boy?" The horse tossed its head slightly, snorting. Bram let out a weak chuckle, shaking his head. Maybe he was losing his mind from the pain. Maybe the cold was playing tricks on him. But then, the horse moved again. This time, it nudged the fallen tree. Bram's breath hitched. Was it possible? Could this horse, this wild creature, understand that he needed help? A new kind of hope sparked inside him. "You're stronger than me, huh?" Bram murmured, his voice laced with desperation. The horse stomped a hoof against the ground, as if responding. Bram had no idea if this was real, if he had just found an unlikely ally in the most impossible moment of his life. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary horse, and Bram's survival now depended on it. The cold night air wrapped around Bram like a suffocating blanket. His breaths were shallow, his fingers numb as he gripped the damp earth beneath him. He couldn't last much longer. But the black Mangalarga Marchador was still there, watching, waiting. Bram knew horses were intelligent, but this was something else. This wasn't just curiosity or instinct. This horse understood. It knew he needed help. "All right, boy. If you really want to help, let's see what you got," Bram murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The horse flicked its ears forward, eyes locked onto Bram's. Then, as if responding to his plea, it moved closer to the fallen tree. Bram held his breath. The horse sniffed at the thick trunk, then stomped the ground. Its muscles tensed. And then, suddenly, it pressed its powerful chest against the tree and pushed. At first, nothing happened. The tree was massive, its weight almost immovable. But the horse didn't stop. It planted its hooves firmly, let out a deep snort, and pushed again. Bram felt a shift. A small one, but it was real. His heart pounded. "That's it, boy. Keep going." The horse reared its head, nostrils flaring. Then it dug in harder. Bram could feel the earth tremble beneath him as the horse pushed with every ounce of strength in its body. The fallen tree groaned, wood creaking under the pressure. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The weight on Bram's leg eased, just slightly, but enough for him to act. This was his chance. Ignoring the pain, Bram grit his teeth and pulled his leg free. A sharp, searing agony shot through him as his boot slid from beneath the crushing bark. He gasped, his vision blurring for a moment, but he was free. His entire body trembled as he collapsed onto his back, gasping for air. He had no idea how bad the injury was. His leg felt like it was on fire, but right now, that didn't matter. He was alive. And it was all because of this horse. Bram turned his head, meeting the dark eyes of the animal once again. The horse stepped back slightly, breathing heavily from the effort. But it never looked away from him. Bram swallowed hard. "I don't know who you are or why you helped me, but..." His voice cracked. "Thank you." The horse exhaled, a slow and steady breath, as if acknowledging his words. For the first time in years, Bram felt something stir inside him. Something he had lost long ago. Hope. But his struggle wasn't over yet. The pain in his leg was unbearable, and his cabin was miles away. He wasn't sure if he could even stand, let alone walk. And then, the horse did something even more unbelievable. It lowered its head and took a step closer, as if offering something. A way out. Bram's breath hitched. Could he really trust this wild creature? Did he even have a choice? Bram stared at the black Mangalarga Marchador, his breath uneven. The horse stood before him, head lowered slightly, eyes steady. It wasn't leaving. It wasn't running. It was waiting. Bram hesitated, his leg throbbing in agony. He had spent most of his life around horses, but never one like this, wild, yet somehow aware of his struggle. He knew the risk of trusting an untamed animal, but he also knew he wouldn't survive the cold night if he stayed here. With a deep breath, Bram gritted his teeth and tried to move. Pain exploded through his leg, nearly knocking him unconscious. He clenched his jaw to keep from screaming. He wouldn't get far like this. Looking up, he saw the horse still watching him. As if it knew. As if it understood what he needed. Bram reached out with a shaking hand and grabbed the horse's thick, silky mane. The animal didn't flinch. Instead, it stood firm, muscles tense but calm, allowing him to pull himself upright. His vision blurred from the effort, but somehow, he managed to swing his good leg over the horse's back. He had no saddle, no reins, nothing to hold onto but the animal itself. He whispered a hoarse, desperate plea. "Take me home, boy." The horse flicked its ears, then, as if it had been waiting for the words, it started walking. The movement jolted Bram's injured leg, sending fresh waves of pain through his body. He sucked in a sharp breath, gripping the horse's mane tighter. But he didn't stop it. He couldn't. Every step forward was a step away from death. The forest was darkening now, the cold growing sharper, but the horse moved with quiet confidence, as if it knew exactly where to go. Bram wasn't sure how much time passed as they traveled through the woods. He fought against exhaustion, his head growing heavy, his body drained. But he wasn't alone. Every time he swayed, feeling himself slipping, the horse adjusted, keeping him steady. It was more than just carrying a rider, it was protecting him. The realization sent a lump to his throat. This horse, this wild creature, had saved his life. As the trees began to thin, revealing the faint outline of his cabin in the distance, Bram felt tears burn in his eyes. He had started this day alone, believing it would end the same way. But fate had other plans. He had been saved, not by another man, not by luck, but by something far more extraordinary. And as the horse carried him the last stretch home, Bram knew one thing for certain. He would never be the same again. The horse stopped just a few feet from Bram's cabin, its breath visible in the crisp night air. Bram could barely keep his eyes open. His body was weak, his leg pulsing with pain, but he had made it home. He let out a shaky breath, resting his forehead against the horse's muscular neck. "You really did it, boy," he whispered. For a moment, he just sat there, feeling the warmth of the animal beneath him, listening to its steady breathing. With great effort, he slid off the horse's back, nearly collapsing as his injured leg buckled beneath him. Before he could hit the ground, he felt the horse shift closer, pressing its body against him, steadying him just enough for him to regain his balance. Bram let out a weak laugh. "Guess you're not done saving me yet, huh?" Using the doorframe for support, Bram finally stumbled inside his cabin. The fire in the hearth had long since died out, leaving the space cold and unwelcoming. He moved as best as he could, lighting a lantern and grabbing an old blanket to wrap around himself. Every part of him ached, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. He turned back toward the door and hesitated. The horse was still there. It hadn't left. Bram had expected it to disappear into the woods the moment he was safe, to return to whatever wild life it had come from. But instead, it stood just outside, watching him. The realization struck him hard. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This horse had chosen to stay. Ignoring the pain in his leg, Bram stepped back outside. The night was quiet, the only sound the distant rustling of trees. He reached out a hand, and for the first time, the horse took a step forward, closing the distance between them. It lowered its head slightly, allowing Bram to touch its forehead. The connection was undeniable now. This wasn't just gratitude or instinct. It was trust. Bram swallowed hard, feeling emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had spent so much of his life alone, believing that was how things were meant to be. But now, standing there with this horse, this guardian, this friend, he realized something had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he never had to be again. Bram barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the events of the day, the crushing weight of the tree, the pain, the fear, and then, the impossible moment when a wild horse had saved his life. He kept expecting to wake up and find that it had all been a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when the first light of dawn crept through the cabin window, he saw the silhouette outside. The horse was still there. With great effort, Bram pushed himself out of bed, wincing as pain shot through his leg. He wrapped it tightly with an old cloth, knowing he'd have to properly treat it later. Right now, there was something more important he needed to do. He needed to face the reality that this horse, this magnificent untamed creature, had stayed by his side. Stepping onto the porch, Bram took in the sight before him. The horse stood near the edge of the clearing, its black coat shimmering in the morning sun. It wasn't tied down, wasn't fenced in. It could leave at any time. But it hadn't. That meant something. Bram slowly made his way forward, his steps unsteady but determined. "I don't know why you stayed," he muttered, voice rough from the cold air, "but I ain't gonna question it." He reached out, and to his amazement, the horse didn't pull away. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, allowing him to rest a hand against its forehead. A deep warmth spread through Bram's chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Companionship. Connection. For a long time, Bram had believed he was meant to live alone, that his days of relying on anyone, or anything, were long gone. But now, as he stood there with this horse, he realized he had been wrong. Maybe fate had other plans for him. Maybe survival wasn't just about getting through the day, but about finding something, or someone, worth living for. A faint smile touched his lips as he stepped back. "Well, if you're gonna stick around, you're gonna need a name," he said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. He looked into those dark, intelligent eyes and nodded. "How about Shadow?" The horse let out a soft snort, almost as if it approved. And just like that, Bram knew, his days of solitude were over. A new chapter of his life had begun. The days passed, and Shadow remained. Every morning, Bram woke up expecting to find the clearing empty, expecting the wild horse to have vanished into the forest. But Shadow was always there, grazing near the cabin or standing by the porch, watching him with those deep, knowing eyes. The horse had saved his life, but Bram wasn't sure if he had truly earned its trust yet. His leg was healing, though slowly. He still walked with a limp, using a wooden staff for support. Chores that once took minutes now took hours, and he found himself frustrated by his own weakness. He wasn't the man he used to be. But every time the doubt crept in, Shadow was there, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. One afternoon, Bram decided to test something. He stepped outside, holding an old leather bridle he had kept from his younger days. Shadow lifted its head, ears twitching as Bram approached. "I know you're not the kind to be tamed," Bram muttered, "but let's see if you'll let me ride you proper this time." Slowly, he raised the bridle, waiting for the horse to pull away. But Shadow didn't move. Bram swallowed hard. He had expected resistance, a fight, maybe even a sudden bolt into the woods. But instead, Shadow lowered its head, allowing Bram to slip the bridle over its face. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the straps. He had trained horses before, but this was different. Shadow wasn't just any horse. Taking a deep breath, Bram gripped the mane and pulled himself up onto the horse's back. The movement sent pain through his leg, but he ignored it. Shadow stood perfectly still, waiting. Then, with a gentle nudge from Bram, the horse began to walk. It wasn't just obedience. It was trust, something rare, something precious. As they moved together through the clearing, Bram felt something shift inside him. He had spent years believing he was meant to be alone, that his best days were behind him. But as the wind brushed against his face and the steady rhythm of Shadow's steps carried him forward, he realized something. Maybe his story wasn't over yet. Maybe, with Shadow by his side, it was just beginning. Bram hadn't felt this alive in years. Riding through the clearing on Shadow's back, he felt the crisp autumn air against his face, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt free. His legs still ached, and he knew he wasn't fully healed yet, but the pain didn't seem to matter anymore. What mattered was the bond growing between him and this incredible animal. As they reached the edge of the forest, Bram gently pulled on the reins, and Shadow came to a smooth stop. The horse's ears flicked back, listening, waiting. Bram let out a slow breath, running a hand through Shadow's dark mane. "Never had a horse like you before," he muttered. "Hell, never met anything like you before." Shadow huffed softly in response, as if acknowledging his words. Looking ahead, Bram's gaze fell on the dense woods beyond. A few weeks ago, he would have never imagined trusting a wild animal, much less riding one. But Shadow had saved him, and in doing so, had given him something he hadn't even realized he had lost: purpose. He had spent years in isolation, telling himself that was how things were meant to be. But now, he wasn't so sure. He slid off the horse's back, wincing as his injured leg protested. Shadow stood perfectly still, watching him carefully. "I don't know why you stayed," Bram admitted, brushing his hand along the horse's muscular neck. "But I'm damn glad you did." It was strange, speaking to an animal like this, but somehow, it felt right. Shadow wasn't just a horse anymore. He was something more. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, and for a brief moment, Bram had a thought. What if Shadow left? What if one day, the horse decided to return to the wild where he truly belonged? The idea sent a strange pang through his chest, but he forced himself to push it aside. Shadow was free, and Bram wouldn't take that away from him. Whatever time they had together, he would be grateful for it. With a final pat on Shadow's side, Bram turned toward the cabin, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't be facing it alone. The days grew colder, the first hints of winter settling over the land. Bram had spent most of his time recovering, tending to his leg as best he could, but he never once felt alone. Shadow remained by his side, following him as he moved around the cabin, watching him with those deep, intelligent eyes. The horse had become more than just a companion. He was family now. One morning, as Bram was chopping wood near the porch, a distant sound caught his ear. Hoofbeats. Not Shadow's, they were heavier, faster. He turned his head sharply toward the treeline and saw them, 3 men on horseback, approaching from the woods. His grip tightened around the axe handle. He hadn't had visitors in years, and out here, unexpected company was rarely good news. As the riders drew closer, Bram felt Shadow tense beside him, ears pinned back, muscles coiled. The horse sensed the danger before he did. The men were rough-looking, dressed in worn coats, their eyes scanning the property with an unsettling familiarity. "Nice horse you got there," one of them said, nodding toward Shadow. "Looks like he don't belong to you." Bram's jaw clenched. They thought Shadow was a stolen horse. Maybe they were ranchers looking for lost livestock, or maybe they were just men who saw an opportunity to take what they wanted. Either way, Bram wasn't about to let them have Shadow. "He ain't stolen," Bram said firmly. "He's free. He stays because he wants to." The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar along his jaw, smirked. "That's so. Well, let's see about that." He whistled sharply and clicked his tongue, the universal sound of calling a horse. Shadow didn't move. The men tried again, whistling louder, but Shadow only snorted and took a step closer to Bram. The horse had made his choice. The leader's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. Shame. A horse like that shouldn't go to waste out here with some crippled old man. Bram tightened his grip on the axe. His leg might have been weak, but he'd fight if he had to. But before he could say another word, Shadow suddenly lunged forward. The horse reared up, letting out a powerful earth-shaking cry, hooves striking the air. The men's horses spooked, rearing back in panic. One of the riders cursed as his horse nearly threw him. "Damn wild thing!" the leader shouted, pulling his horse away. Shadow didn't back down. He stood his ground, muscles tense, eyes locked onto the intruders with a fire Bram had never seen before. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the leader scoffed, shaking his head. "Not worth it," he muttered. He yanked on his reins, turning his horse back toward the woods. The others followed, grumbling under their breath. Within seconds, they were gone. Bram exhaled, his heart still pounding. He turned to Shadow, who stood tall, ears still pinned back, nostrils flaring. The horse had defended him, protected him, chosen him. Running a hand over Shadow's strong neck, Bram let out a low chuckle. "Guess you're as stubborn as I am, huh?" Shadow gave a deep, steady breath, as if to say yes. Bram had spent years believing he didn't need anyone. But now, as he stood beside this horse, his horse, he realized he had been wrong. He wasn't alone. And he never would be again. Winter arrived, bringing with it the biting cold of the mountains. Every morning, Bram woke up feeling the persistent pain in his leg, a constant reminder of the accident that nearly cost him his life. But now, as he opened the door of his cabin, he was never alone. Shadow was always there, waiting for him. Their routine became a cycle of mutual trust. Bram took care of the horse, and somehow, Shadow took care of him. The days were quiet, filled only with the sound of the wind rustling through the bare branches and the steady rhythm of Shadow's hooves against the frozen ground. Bram started talking to the horse, sharing stories of his past, reminiscing about the days when he was young and strong. Shadow listened, his dark eyes gleaming under the pale winter sun, as if he understood every word. Bram never imagined he would have a friend as loyal as this. But life always held surprises, and one morning, as Bram stepped outside, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. Shadow was gone. Panic gripped him tighter than the icy wind. He called out for the horse, fear creeping into his voice. Minutes passed, then hours, and a hollow ache settled in his heart. The thought of losing the one being who had stood by his side was more painful than any wound he had ever suffered. Then, as night fell, a familiar sound echoed in the distance, the steady, confident rhythm of hooves against the snow. Bram's breath caught in his throat as he saw a shadow emerging from the trees. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, following cautiously, was a gray mare, her movements hesitant yet trusting. Bram let out a breathless laugh, his eyes misty. Shadow hadn't left. Instead, he had brought someone else to be part of their new life. Months passed, and as spring arrived, Bram noticed something that made him smile in a way he hadn't in years. The mare was pregnant. Shadow had not only chosen to stay, but he had built his own family alongside Bram. It was a new beginning for all of them. For the first time in a long while, Bram realized he wasn't just surviving. He was truly living. And so, in that quiet clearing, where a man and a horse had forged an unbreakable bond of trust and loyalty, a new life was about to be born. And Bram knew, deep in his heart, that he would never be alone again.